Hi, I'm Declan, an aerospace engineering junior studying here at UAH. I have been working in UAH's Plasma and Electrodynamics Research Laboratory, which is headed by Dr. Gabe, for about 1.5 to 2 years. We spent the past summer simulating the fluid flow of an atmospheric pressure plasma jet, or APPJ, from the lab. I'm going to share that summer work in this video by discussing the background on APPJs, detailing our model, explaining the results, and concluding with some notes on our plans to build upon this work. Let us start by discussing what APPJs are and how they are used. For this, we start with what is a plasma. A plasma is an ionized gas, or, in other words, a gas with a significant number of free electrons unbound from atoms and molecules. This ionization turns the gas into a mix of chemical species. Familiar examples of plasmas include the sun, lightning, neon lights, and fire. Historically, plasmas have usually been generated at high temperatures, where the gas gets so hot that the electrons melt off the atoms. Plasmas are also generated at low pressures to facilitate gas ionization. However, as the name suggests, APPJs are generated at atmospheric pressures that are familiar to humans. While there are various ways to generate APPJs, most use a noble gas like helium or argon that is flowed in the vicinity of electrodes. These electrodes are connected to a pulse power supply and produce a significant electric field, which creates an ionization wave. Interestingly, this ionization wave forms in a donut-shaped bullet that propagates at high velocities. The pulse nature of the plasma generation and the high speed of the bullet means that the plasma appears as a jet to our eyes. This method of generation does not involve high temperatures, and by generating at room pressure, they do not require specialized equipment such as vacuum chambers. As a result, APPJs are both safe and useful for biological applications, as the chemical treatment can be delivered without harming the material. However vast applications that APPJs are, I would like to focus on our specific APPJ. We use a helium-based jet that flows around a 1 mm diameter tungsten electrode and through a 4 mm inner diameter quartz tube. The gas is typically fed at a speed of 2.65 meters per second, while the electrode is hooked up to a power supply that gives 8 kilovolt pulses that last for a microsecond at a repetition frequency of 6 kHz. The jet produces nitrogen and oxygen-based chemical species, which have been used to treat plant seeds, Venus flytraps, and purify water. Recently, Gott, a graduate student in the lab, performed experiments to characterize the jet's chemical properties and length across various flow rates, pulse widths, voltages, and frequencies. This characterization allows us to understand the optimal operating conditions for the aforementioned treatments. However, the jet has yet to be simulated, which opens additional opportunities for characterization. Before discussing our simulation, I should mention the work done by Characterization et al., which can be found at the DOI for reference 2 of the poster. They performed similar flow characterization on their plasma pencil APPJ. They focused on the minimum mole fraction needed for plasma propagation at various flow rates. While their jet is a different design, we can compare the behaviors and trends we find to their results. This allows us to understand where our design fits in the literature and gain insight into how the APPJ operates. It also helps quantify the characteristics of the flow that we are interested in. We want to understand how the helium and air of our jet mix, as the lower ionization energy of the helium is needed for the plasma to propagate. However, we need a measurable tool to understand this mixing, which is what the mole fraction does. This interest in the mixing forms the basis for how we set up our model. Now, I'd like to discuss our model setup. For software, we employ ANSYS Fluent, which is a robust, commercial, computational fluid dynamics package. Fluent uses a volume-based Navier-Stokes fluid solver, meaning that the fluid gets partitioned into small volume elements, and the computer then solves the flow properties for each element using the Navier-Stokes equations. We have used ANSYS before to simulate adapters for the APPJ, but had yet to use it for a full jet simulation. For this simulation, there are two major models within ANSYS that we employ in addition to the geometric components. The simulation geometry uses a 2D model as the jet is symmetric in 3D space. The geometry employs a 3 cm long tube, which is the length of the tube used at the end of the jet, that flows into a large space of surrounding air. This space is a 0.2 by 0.2 meter square that is partitioned into 25,628 cells, with the maximum size of a cell being set to 1/4 of a millimeter. This geometry is large enough that a large lab room is simulated, but small enough to reduce computational costs for efficient simulation. Likewise, the mesh sizing is small enough to give accurate results, but large enough to generate the mesh and reduce computational costs. The first important model is the species transport model. This model is typically used to model chemical reactions and fluid flows, but as we were modeling a purely flow simulation with non-reacting gases, we did not turn on the reaction mechanisms. While it is true that the jet has many chemical species, these are generated because of ionization, which this model does not account for. The species modeling allows us to model the interactions and mixing between the helium and air by accounting for the different gas properties. As we perform the simulation to understand how the flow characteristics of the jet behave, the species transport is key for the model. The second important model was the RNG K-epsilon turbulence model. The base K-epsilon model is a robust turbulence model that uses the turbulent kinetic energy to determine turbulence effects in the flow. The RNG component is a modification to the base K-epsilon model that allows the simulation to account for all scales of motion. We use this turbulence model over a laminar model as experimental results show turbulence in the flow at higher flow rates. The turbulence has effects on the mixing as we see a plume of helium towards the end of the jet. The RNG accounting is particularly important as the mixing from turbulence can happen at many different scales in the simulation, and we want to account for all mixing to get the best results possible. From this model, we gain two important numerical results: the minimum mass and minimum mole fraction of helium as a function of distance from the jet exit. These quantities allow for numerical characterization of the mixing of the helium and air. These values are calculated by drawing a line in the post-processing at the length of the jet from experiments and changing the minimum display of the mass and mole fractions until the jet just crosses the line. We do this for each flow rate and then form plots, as displayed in figures 2 and 3. From these plots, we can then see how different flow rates affect the APPJ mixing and compare to the other APPJs. The important trend observed is that the minimum fraction logarithmically increases as the flow rate increases. At first glance, this trend seems to suggest that the higher flow rates are less effective at ionizing the helium, but that is not quite the case. As flow rate increases, the sections of higher helium concentrations are observed to expand. This expansion means that the same ionization energy is expended over more helium than before, hence why we see the higher minimums. This result shows that the exact helium-to-air mixture composition is not the critical factor for jet length, but the ionization energy available. The ionization energy concept is further backed up by experimental results which show the jet length increasing as the applied voltage and frequencies are increased. Increasing these conditions adds more energy into the system, so seeing them cause greater propagation points to the ionization energy being critical for jet length. The mole fraction graph is also important as we can compare results to the mole fraction graph from Karakas et al. This graph can be found as figure 7 in the second reference of this poster and should also be displayed on screen. Their graph shows the same logarithmic trend of increasing minimums as the flow rate increases. As we get similar results, we gain confidence in the results of our simulations. However, they find lower minimum fraction values than the ones seen in figure 3. What is interesting about these results is that their jet uses similar operating conditions at voltages between 4.5 and 7 kilovolts, pulses lasting 1 microsecond, and a 5 kHz repetition frequency. However, the electrode setup used for the jet in Karakos et al. And the electrode setup for our jet are different. Thus, our results suggest the jets cannot simply be compared by operating conditions alone, as the electrode setup of the jet has important effects on the jet length. While the jet length is useful for comparing APPJs, we are also interested in the plasma properties of the jet, which brings us to our future work. From this flow characterization work, we plan to move the model to a different simulation, SPF Max. This modeling package was developed by Dr. Jason Cassidy, who is also a part of UAH's Mechanical and Aerospace Engineering Department, and uses a particle-based method rather than the volumetric grid-based method used in ANSYS Fluent. The advantage of SPF Max is the built-in Maxwell equation solver, which allows us to model the electromagnetic behavior of the plasma jet. Once we model the electromagnetic effects of the jet in SPF Max, we plan to use this model in two ways. First, we want to characterize the electron-ion temperature and density, which are important plasma benchmarks that help us understand how the jet performs across varying operating conditions. Second, we plan to use the model to simulate how the plasma deflects due to the presence of magnets. This work is part of a Department of Energy grant to study plasma deflection due to magnetic nozzles, which has applications to spacecraft propulsion. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this presentation. If you have any questions or comments about the work, feel free to reach out to me at dgb0008@uah.edu. Seeing as there's no further questions from the audience, I'm going to end the presentation here. Have a good day.